So what keeps the Fed policy, what puts a box around the Fed policy as far as throttle on the money printer? Correspondingly, by the way, when you pull the throttle back, that's raising interest rates and that's cutting back on the money supply, okay? So the danger to an economy, now why not go full throttle? Well, because again, you're printing out debt that eventually has to be paid back, and companies gorge on cheap money, people gorge on cheap money, so there's limits to it, clearly. Now, if you raise interest rates too fast, you've got a debt servicing issue, right? I mean, as I say, people have adjustable rate mortgages, and when the Fed raises interest rates, suddenly the mortgage payments go up. So if you do that too quickly, you run into a situation where more people start defaulting on their home loans and things like that. So that's one thing to take into account. Other variables that they need to consider: what's the inflation rate? I mean, how much are prices rising, and are wages keeping up with prices? So where's the standard of living moving to? And then also, what's the unemployment rate? You want to get to full employment, which really is about 4.5%. And the reason I say 4.5% is full employment is because there's always transitory unemployment, okay? I mean, people are moving between jobs. People are moving from the West Coast to the East Coast or a different part of the country. And those people have a window of time where they're not employed. And that's always a certain percentage of the population. So they just estimate that to say, okay, at any moment in time, 4.5% of the population is going to be doing something other than working when they're of working age. So that's called transitory unemployment. So again, variables that they consider are inflation and unemployment. So back to the Fed. Jerome Powell, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Now, there's 7 governors, okay, from different parts of the country. Contradiction alert. The book says the Federal Reserve is not part of the U.S. government. It is a private entity. But then in the next paragraph, it says the 7 governors of the Federal Reserve are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So maybe it's not a government agency, but there sure is a really tight connection, to the government. And personal opinion, I mean, the governors certainly get influenced by, if the people who are confirming them and the people who are appointing them are upset with them, that means they're not going to be a governor for very long, or they're not going to be a Fed chair. Now, the question is, can you fire a chair of the Federal Reserve? This is not in the book, but again, just street knowledge from my previous labors in the field. No, the president cannot fire a chairman of a Federal Reserve, but the president can remove the chair and demote the chair down to a Fed governor. Okay, so if you're one of the chosen 7 that's on the Board of Governors, one of them is the chair of the Federal Reserve. So if Jerome Powell fell out of favor with Joe Biden, I mean, Biden could just simply demote him to being a governor, and then another governor would be promoted up to the Fed chair, and then the Senate would have to confirm it. So there is a checks and balances system there. There's 12 Federal Reserve, and these are things that the book gets into a little bit here as far as the Federal Reserve bank districts. There's 12 of them. So the book will talk about the 7 governors, and they'll also talk about the 12 Fed districts. And each of these Fed districts has a very distinct function, okay? I mean, clearly they share information among each other because there's got to be a nationwide picture of how the economy is doing and where interest rates are headed. But for example, the Philadelphia Fed, one of their key priorities is to publish an economic forecast early in a given year. So in 2022, between February and March, you'll see the Philadelphia Fed economic forecast. Okay, that's kind of their job. The Dallas Fed is responsible for electronic fund transfers. The St. Louis Fed, if you go to their website, they've got something called FRED. What's FRED? FRED is Federal Reserve Economic Data. And if you really get into economics, it's an interesting, they actually have Fed data tutorials for high school and JUCO and four-year college economics students. So if you're going to get into economics, and why wouldn't you? I'll leave it there. If you're going to get into economics, you just basically can play around with this Federal Reserve economic data, and you can run scenarios, but it gives a very basic explanation of the economic system. So if you are getting into economics, it's nice to surf around that website in preparation for enrolling in an economics program. Okay, so just 2 cents worth on that. The Atlanta Fed is responsible for the GDP forecasts. The San Francisco Fed, I actually was on a tour of the San Francisco Fed. We, again, because I worked for a community bank trade association, and we arranged a day at the Fed to get a backstage tour of the Federal Reserve. And I alluded to this earlier, but basically they're responsible for the cash flowing around the country. And as I think I mentioned last time, we got to sort of the back room. They don't take a general public tour to this area, but we got into the back room area where there's this thick glass, sort of like hockey rink glass, plexiglass. And on the other side of it, there's a huge shredder. And literally this guy's like with a pitchfork. There's a pallet of wrapped dollar bills, and this guy is sort of just like taking a pitchfork and throwing it into the shredder. Maybe it wasn't a pitch, but something like a pitchfork. Anyway, into the shredder, and I'm like, how much money is that? And it was like $10 million in one bundle. Where they're like little hungry 8-year-olds outside a bakery with their noses pressed to the glass. Any chance you could flip one of those over the fence here and, let us just paw away at a few bucks, so we had to mind our manners, so that was not possible. That would be frowned upon by the keepers of the establishment. Okay. The other thing too, as far as money supply, the chapter the first half of the chapter does get into what M1 is. M1 is basically liquid money, meaning money in checking accounts, money in savings accounts. And then there's M2, which is easily accessible money, plus M1. Okay, so M1, checking accounts, savings accounts, cash. M2 would be certificates of deposit. For example, you could sell that within 3 days, get your money out. You have to pay a penalty, but you have access to those funds fairly quickly. So M2 is easily accessible funds plus M1, and that is in the book. So, and I think that is a quiz question. What is M1? So there's that. Investing hint. Generally speaking, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but if you took a graph of the money supply over the past 5 years and superimposed it over a stock market chart, very close resemblance, okay, very tight correlation. So the more money that's in circulation, that money needs a good home, right? And in recent years, that good home's been the stock market. So it's, there's a long economic discussion as far as, is it allocated properly? Don't know. Some people would argue it is, some would argue that it isn't. But the fact is, the more money you put into circulation, typically, the stock market will increase. Okay, the value of assets increased. As I say, the money needs a home. So we'll leave it there. We're at the 13-minute mark, so that's about a half hour of YouTube as usual. And we will see you on Zoom.